Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the course Marxism with Chinese Characteristics with Professor Joseph Mahoney. Amongst the menageries of Marxism, past and present, few have been as successful or more misunderstood than Chinese Marxism. Critics have dismissed it as revisionist and anachronistics, exceptionalist and primitive, and debated its true color. Is it red? Too red? Not red enough? Complicating matters. Many who have embraced Chinese Marxism or some elements therein, e.g., Mao Zedong thought, have too often valorized concepts like class struggle and cultural revolution as universal and transhistorical practices, and even attempted to emulate them in excessive and self-defeating ways. Meanwhile, in China today, Chinese Marxism frequently finds itself reduced in the vernacular of propaganda to a variable but vacuous formalism and an uncontestable state ideology, making it vulnerable to accusations that it exemplifies a reactionary tyranny of the present, or perhaps something much worse, empty words. Joseph Mahoney is a professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University, executive director of the International Center for Advanced Political Studies, founder and director of the International Graduate Program in Politics, founder and director of the Center for Ecological Civilization, Vice Dean for the Institute of Singularity Politics, Associate Editor, US-based Journal of Chinese Political Science, and co-editor ECNU Review. Um, Professor Joseph Mahoney, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Always be suspicious of someone with too many titles. They're clearly overcompensating for some sort of insecurity or vulnerability. Thank you all for joining, and we have a full schedule tonight. Um, a couple of notes. We'll go through the syllabus. I think the original title that I proposed was simply Chinese Marxism. Marxism with Chinese characteristics is not a real term. Um, but I think it was something that the center felt might be a more suitable selling feature. So I'll simply sell what I'm doing is teaching Chinese Marxism. And as an aside, I'd like to point out that the word Maoism, or in Chinese Maozhui, is taboo in China. Now, I was in a taxi cab in Beijing last week, and the guy driving the cab was from Fujian, and he had a medallion of Mao Zedong attached to his dash, and he started giving me a long lecture on Maozhui, on Maoism, which I found enjoyable. So you still hear it in the vernacular sometimes, but officially the word is taboo. We say Mao Zedong thought, and so that's the term that I'll be using because China is rather sensitive about using terms in the right way. For example, in China, we never say CCP, we say CPC for the Communist Party of China. And the Chinese government considers this a sign of respect that you use the terms as they themselves use them. And then we also see that, of course, there are people in the West who deliberately use those other terms, CCP, for example. Um, some of them use it because it was something that was done in the past, but some of them use it intentionally as a little um, uh, form of antagonism. So I will be using just the formal, normal terms that we use here. So with that said, we can start going through the syllabus. I understand the syllabus was sent to most of you, and I'm going to share screen, see if I can figure out how to do that here. You can see it?
Yep.
Okay, I hope it's big enough to read. We don't need to read through the course description. Just a few notes. There are no required text per se. There's no book or anything that you need to buy. And with regard to readings, I've proved all the readings. I did add a few more readings today. And to be honest with you, I don't expect you to do all of these readings. A lot of them are referential. So if I say something that you want to refer to, or if I refer to it, you can go and track these things down. The hypertext links, these are mostly in Marxist.org, which is a very valuable website some of you might be familiar with. If not, take some time and explore it a bit. And the ones that are not hypertext, these are books that are posted in the shared folder in Google Classroom. So you'll be able to access those. I was sharing this with a colleague who introduced me to this program, who's taught before with it. And he said, he made two observations about the syllabus. The first is he said that the syllabus weights heavily in the direction of Xi Jinping, the current paramount leader in China. But I would say that it's really weighted primarily in the direction of Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping. And there's a reason for this. First, because Mao is the one who, at least by name, establishes a lot of the key concepts, and certainly the organizational structure of the party, which is sustained to this day. And here, sometimes in Chinese, we when we talk about so Mao Zedong Sixiang, or Mao Zedong thought. So thought is sort of like a higher order category. And then underneath that, we had Deng Xiaoping theory, or Deng Xiaoping Li Lun, which is more subordinate in so much as we are entering a new period where we haven't yet figured out really how to concretize our theory and practice. So we're kind of muddling through, or as Deng used to say, crossing the river by feeling the stones. And so we were in a period of theory with Deng and Jiang Zemin, who then gives us the theory of the three represents, and then with the points raised by the fourth generation of leadership of Hu Jintao, where we have the scientific development concept and the harmonious society concept. So all of these, those two, Jiang and Hu, are largely under the theoretical movement initiated by Deng Xiaoping. But once we reach Xi Jinping, he and the party assert that we're in a new era, and that we have now drawn the lessons of that period of theoretical interregnum. And so we're now back on a solid moment of okay, this is what we know, this is what we think, and this is how we're moving. So so this is why these two periods of thought, from Mao Zedong thought to now Xi Jinping thought, and of course the extent to which Xi Jinping thought is contingent on Mao Zedong thought, this is why we will be weighted most heavily in the direction of these two. And then finally, because Xi has been the leader now for a generation and a half, and a lot of the changes that we've seen, a lot of the changes that are now relevant to your understanding of China and China's role in the world are linked directly to his tenure at the top. So that's another reason why we'll be emphasizing him. But here you can see, just as we scroll through, how this will work. Okay, so the rest of it here is boilerplate. So I'll just go back up to the requirements, and I'll touch on the second point that my colleague raised. So pretty basic attendance and participation. I love if you have questions, if you want to interrupt me if I don't see you raising your hand, just feel free to do that. if it becomes too distracting, then I'll politely point it out. But otherwise, let's give it a shot. The For the remaining 70%, you have two options. One is you can produce an essay of 2,500 to 3,100 words on any topic related to Chinese Marxism, and just follow the normal academic citation rules. And I don't care which, if you use APA or MLA or Chicago, whatever formatting you prefer is fine with me as long as it's consistent. Or option B, you can prepare and submit for credible publication a book review, magazine article, essay, or research paper to any non-vanity publication on any topic related to the course. And in order to get credit for this, you have to show submission proof. So if you submit it via email or through an online system, just screenshot it and add it to your paper. You don't have to get it published to get credit. But what you should notice here is that, sometimes a magazine article maybe the magazine imposes an 800 word limit or 1,000 word limit, or a book review has, 900 words or whatever it is, or maybe you have an essay that you're developing and you want to submit it and it's somehow topically related to the class, but you haven't submitted it for another course. Feel free to use that work. But the bottom line is I like to encourage in the program that I direct, and certainly here, that you don't waste time rating meaningless academic works. I would much prefer that you be able to write something for publication and put that on your CV. And usually when I do this, I don't know if I can do this in this class, but we have a lot of students here from around the world. And generally I make the requirement open so they can publish in whatever language they choose. So if they have so we have a lot of students from Russia. If they have an inside track to a publication in Russian, that's fine. They can submit the article in Russian, and then we can read it with AI if necessary. I don't know if the program allows that. If they do, fine. It can be in whatever language you prefer. If they insist on it being English, then that's what we'll do. But we can follow up on that later. Are there any questions here? Now, let me go back up to the attendance and participation because there's one thing I neglected there. So because there's no way you could have done all the reflection, all the readings or some of the readings for tonight's class, I'm only requiring 3 reflections. So this would be like the normal standard American graduate seminar approach. I was told to teach this at a graduate level. So generally in this model, what you would do is you would read at least some of the readings, and you would write, in this case, 500 to 800 words, where you're reflecting on the reading. You can raise questions, you can elucidate points, cite when necessary, and then you can post these in the online folder where other people can see what you're reading and thinking about. And then I'll try to access those and reflect on those as I'm preparing for the um, um, class. And there's a typo here on the syllabus. Do 24 hours. It should be 24 hours before the class. Okay, so if today was the second class, then 24 hours ago, so that I could then have some chance through our time change differences to see what you've written. Okay, I'll make that little edit on the syllabus and repost. So are there any questions here? Anyone? Good, because that's boring. All right, now I'm going to teach Chinese Marxism in a way that, maybe some of you've encountered similar approaches. Probably not. I won't say that my approach is idiosyncratic. There were some scholars who were thinking in similar lines back before I did my dissertation. I defended in 2003, I think. And so there were scholars like Nick Knight and a few others who had really paid close attention to what was really fundamentally different about Chinese Marxism from, say, Soviet Marxism. Or here's another term that I'll use, classical Marxism. Classical Marxism would be the Marxism of Marx and sometimes also Engels. And then we would also differentiate sort of the classical Marxism, which would be, what Marx and Engels said and wrote and what we think they meant, versus Soviet Marxism, which is going to be largely defined by Lenin and Stalin, but not exclusively, versus Western Marxism, which arises as, in some respects, a critique of Soviet Marxism, but also as a different type of Marxism that was trying to solve the theoretical questions about why they didn't have the Marxist revolution in the most advanced capitalist societies as Marx had predicted, but instead these were happening in other places, the Soviet Union, China, so forth and so on. And then, of course, we'll have Chinese Marxism, which is substantively different in ways. Now, to get started here, let me open the PPT. So I'm going to have to share a screen, and I'm going to do it on playing the slideshow, which I don't know if I'll be able to see anyone at that point. So if you have something, if there's some sort of technical difficulty, or you have a question, just yell, okay? Okay, so this is kind of a messy slide, but it's trying to like convey 3 or 4 points at the same time. And the first thing I'd like to point out here is this is the Grundrisse. This is a term we use in Western Marxism for what in the Soviet Union and in China they call the preparatory notebooks, Marxist preparatory notebooks for Capital, Volume 1. And some of you are aware that some Western Marxists, they don't like to use the old MECW, Marx Engels collected works from the Soviet Union. They prefer to use the Penguin edition. And in this case, this would be the Grundrisse, the Penguin edition of the Grundrisse. And this would be cited by people like Frederick Jameson and David Harvey and these sorts of people. But one of the interesting points in here from Martin Nicholas, who was the translator and wrote the foreword, is this is a footnote from that I've posted here. So I'll elucidate the larger point and then hit on his point. Lenin said that in order to understand Marx, you first had to understand Hegel. And later, one of the things that we're kind of getting from Nicholas is that in order to understand Marx, we don't have to understand Hegel as Lenin suggested. Rather, we can start with on contradiction and on practice. These are two famous essays. In Chinese, we call them the two classics, or the Lianglun, written in 1937 in the Yan'an Revolutionary Base period in Northwest China. And one of the things you'll see here is that Nicholas says, written in 1937, they remain today the classic exposition materialist dialectics as a whole. These essays are at one and the same time strictly orthodox in the Marxist sense and highly original. Okay, and this half of that statement is true. Half of that statement is true. In other words, they are highly original, but they are not orthodox. In other words, there is a profound difference in the two classics, in on practice and on contradiction. And Mao Zedong knows that there's a difference, and Joseph Stalin knows there's a difference. And this is where we really begin to see articulated in a very advanced theoretical form the fundamental difference between Chinese and Soviet dialectics. So that's part of what we want to explain in our talk. But we're not just going to focus on the difference between Chinese and Soviet dialectics, but the difference between Chinese Marxism and Western thought as a whole. Okay. Now, the other thing I'd like to point to here is this question: where do correct ideas come from? And this is an essay from Mao Zedong, and he opens that essay, with the statement, and most Chinese know this, at least the basic idea. Where do correct ideas come from? Do they drop from the skies? No. Are they innate in the mind? No. They come from social practice and from it alone. They come from three kinds of social practice: the struggle for production, the class struggle, and scientific experiment. It is man's social being that determines his thinking, right? This is a very clear statement. Now, I will come to my final point here in our brief little introduction. My PhD was essentially in critical theory, and for many years I taught, before I got in trouble for political activities, I taught critical methods in Washington, and then went to another university where I got in trouble there politically. And that led me to getting bought out and blacklisted and exiled, and then working for the Central Committee in Beijing. And I remember, I had written my dissertation on Jiang Zemin's Sangha Daibiao, the three represents. And in order to understand that, I had to contextualize it in Deng Xiaoping theory. To understand that, I had to contextualize it in Mao Zedong thought, and then go back to Marx and Engels. But I was coming from this Western Marxist tradition, which I would argue, and I think fairly, has a tendency to be hyper-theoretical relative to practice, right? In other words, there's been a long tendency in Western Marxism to be more focused on theory and theoretical discussions and theoretical debates than actually being able to go out and organize and exercise an effective politics of praxis. Now, we know why that's the case, so I'm not blaming Western Marxists for that inadequacy. It's rather it's rather that the Chinese experience is the opposite. Okay, so to illustrate this, I'll give you an anecdote. I was in Beijing. I was working for this top think tank under the Central Committee, and this is in 2010. And I was having a theoretical discussion with a senior scholar there, and I was, making this theoretical point, and he was, being kind and a little tolerant of me. And I was, struggling with what I saw was the deviation between, or the separation between political practice and theory. And he suddenly laughed out loud, and he says, in China, politics comes first. We make up the theory later. Okay, so whatever we need to explain in theory terms, first we figure out the politics. Okay, now when I heard that, it terrified me, and I think it would terrify most Western Marxists. I have a postdoc here. He got his PhD in Marxism from Paris. He's from Canada. He's the guy who had taught in your program, and he puts theory in the first position, and he's brilliant in theory, right? And I used to be similar to this, okay? But and so when this scholar told me that, it was like the Pope saying, "I'm not sure I believe in Jesus anymore." It was some sort of like fundamental threat to the to put it in a different way, we tend to be very, very protective and put theory in the first position in the West because that's all we have often, but also because we feel like we have to constantly defend Marx and recover him and preserve his genius. That is not the primary occupation in China. And the leaders who came to Marxism did not come to Marxism because they were attracted to the theory, but rather they saw something that was useful for them in terms of solving some of the practical political problems and crises that they were facing um, in the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles and the May 4th movement, when China was exploring a lot of different options, including Mao Zedong, who was working as a librarian assistant in Peking University or Beida, in the Tushuguan there, the library, what we now call the Red Room or the Red Chamber, under the direction of Li Dajiao. And this will be something we'll come back to in a little bit, because Li Dajiao, who unfortunately would later be martyred by the old Zhang um, warlord of Northeast China, they invaded the Soviet embassy and hanged him. But Li Dajiao and Mao Zedong had something in common. They were both from peasant backgrounds, and that will be interesting to us later. So, so keep in mind that as we move through this, as we're looking at the two classics, that politics comes first, and you'll see that aspect being emphasized again and again. But just to get off this page, the one thing that I think Nicholas is right is I think that if you understand the two classics, you are prepared to read Marx. If you understand Mao's two classics, but you need to understand that the way that Mao understands Marxism is different from how Stalin, Lenin, and maybe even Marx himself, and certainly I would argue Engels, understood Marxism. Now, we're gonna jump here to Immanuel Kant, and I don't know how familiar you are with Kant. Don't worry, he's my least favorite philosopher, so we're not going to linger here. I should say Heidegger is my least favorite, but I really don't like dancing with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason because it's such a struggle. But there is a very interesting point in the Critique of Pure Reason where Kant essentially argues that there are two types of thinking. And he calls one of them properly dialectic, and the other he calls analytic. Now, when he uses the term analytic, he's being normative. In other words, he wants to use sort of a positive description for that form of thought. So it's going to be analysis, it's going to be analytical. If we were being non-normative in our description, we would simply call it linear thought. And he will tell you that linear thought comes from the Aristotelian tradition, all right, based on Aristotle's three laws of logic. And on the other hand, we have the dialectic, he says. He says we can't get rid of the dialectic because sometimes we do encounter contradictions. However, in his lectures on logic, he makes it clear, which is a separate work, he makes it clear his true sentiments. He describes dialectics as the logic of illusion and as metaphysical juggling. Now, to be fair to Kant, dialectics had been abused in the West, especially by the scholastics, and chief among them, Thomas Aquinas, had been used as a type of metaphysical juggling, insomuch as Aquinas was trying to juggle between Aristotle and the Augustinian theology that had been the church's guidepost for so long. And so he is trying to preserve the church. He's trying to create a return. Aquinas is trying to create an opening to bring Aristotle back, to bring science back, and to, in a way, open the door for Europe to exit the Dark Ages and to move forward, which, by the way, happens, of course. You do see once Aquinas is able to bring Aristotle back in a way that the Pope will allow, that this creates this domino effect that will lead to the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific and industrial revolutions, and all the things that follow, good and bad. But nevertheless, he is guilty, as Kant says, of metaphysical juggling in terms of how he constructs a dialectic between Augustine and Aristotle, principally. But let's focus here on the two types and sort of the different terminologies that we might associate with these two types. So with dialectical, sometimes we'll have scholars preferring the term correlative thinking, especially when they're talking about China. Now, this will include people like David Hull and Roger Ames. I have one of their books. It was too big for me to email, and because I didn't have permission to edit the file. We'll figure that out later. There are 10 pages in that book anticipating China that I think are well worth a read. I think we'll hit some of the points, paragraphs in this lecture, so you can ignore it if you want. They don't like to use the word dialectical for two reasons. One, because they argue that dialectic is a Greek concept, and there's no reason for us to force a Greek concept into Chinese thinking. And secondly, they also don't want to normalize the Chinese Marxist emphasis on seeing the historical value of correlative thinking in the form of yin-yang thought as being congruent with dialectical thinking. So they don't want to pander to the Marxist position, nor do they want to impose the ancient Greek concept. So instead of saying dialectical thought in the Chinese historical or traditional context, going back to Lao Tzu, they will say correlative thinking. Nevertheless, whether you use correlative thinking or dialectical thinking, I'm fine with using dialectical. It was historically dominant in China as yin-yang xixiang in a pre-modern, but also admittedly often too idealistic form. I'm not going to expand on that. Whereas in the analytical or linear thinking, it was historically dominant in the West, and we'll go back to explaining what that means. And this is certainly before Hegel and Marx and after. And we will notice that as a radical version of linear thought becomes culturally hegemonic and totalizing in the West, it's also consistent as the logic of capitalism, nationalism, individualism, bourgeois social sciences, and so on. It's the logic of unchangeable differences, steady state, dualism, so forth and so on. And conversely, in China, we'll see that yin-yang xixiang was not especially congruent or capable of imagining these ideas of individualism or even the nation state. One of the key points that we make about China is that China historically was not a nation state, it was a civilization state. And in fact, the first modern, or even you could extend the argument to say the first nation state in the way that we conceptualize it as a modern concept is in fact England, and the beginnings of that start with Henry VIII around 1500, when we also begin to see um, the legal formation of private property and the idea of national citizens um, who tie their fate to the nation and so forth and so on. Anyway, any questions or comments here? Nevertheless, we did have in the Western tradition an outlier, a significant outlier, as a pre-Socratic in Heraclitus. And Heraclitus, you're probably familiar, um, famously said that you can't step in the same river twice. And according to tradition, at least the Apocrypha, he has a student named Cratylus who concluded, if that's true, then in fact you can't step in the same river once because it's never the same river. It's always a changing river, right? And so one of the things that we see here is that Heraclitus is associated with a term, the unity of opposites. Now, he did not use this phrase precisely that we know of, but it is widely used to describe his thinking. And keep in mind, we don't have most of his books. Most of his books were destroyed and lost, and all we have are the fragments where he's like quoted sometimes by Aristotle or Plato or others. So he may have used something, a term like this, but in fact, um, we comfortably describe his thinking as being consistent with the unity of opposites. So one of his quotes is, "All things come into being by conflict of opposites, and the sum of things flows like a stream. Conflict and tension are natural states, and justice is achieved through harmonization." Now, this, when Hegel is going back, so one of the things that we're going to see is that Hegel will come after Kant, and Hegel will be provoked by Kant. And what Hegel will realize is that the Western tradition, for whatever reason, had neglected to develop a dialectical way of thinking, a robust dialectical way of thinking. And so he doesn't blame Kant entirely for um, denigrating dialectics. In fact, Kant's critique of dialectics is largely well deserved, in so much as dialectics was not well developed and was deserving of criticism. But Hegel took this as a charge to develop the dialectic in the Western tradition. And to do this, he largely goes back as a starting point to Heraclitus. And a lot of his ideas are developed in this return to Heraclitus. The interconnectedness of opposites, for example, was a powerful influence on Hegel's concept of the absolute, and how opposing elements form a complex unity, which, in his opinion, is a fundamental aspect of reality and a driving force behind its continuous development. However, and if you learn nothing else from the first few slides, if you don't already know it, then learn Aristotle's three laws of logic. So, because what I will fundamentally argue is that that understanding this, the primary law in particular, is the key to is one of the keys to unlocking the difference between ultimately Chinese Marxism and other forms. So Aristotle gives us three laws: the law of identity, which is simply A is A, B is B, so forth and so on. Second, the law of non-contradiction, A cannot be A and not A at the same time. And we refer to this as the primary law. And third, the law of excluded middle, that there's no position between A and B that is both A and B, right? Now, we refer to the second law as the primary law because you can derive the first and the third from the second. And it becomes a common statement. We see it in Aquinas, but we also see it in the Islamic scholar Ibn Sina, saying that the law of non-contradiction is the law of thought. If your thinking is not guided by the law of non-contradiction, then what you're doing is not thinking. What you're doing is engaging in nonsense. Okay. Ibn Sina famously says, if a man doesn't believe in the law of non-contradiction, then burn him. Burn him until he agrees there's a difference between being burned and not being burned. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that Aristotle was not the first to articulate the law of non-contradiction. We can also find a similar expression in the Hindu Vedas. And so one of the questions is, did he learn this? Was there some sort of transfer of knowledge? Well, of course, we know that Aristotle's student, Alexander, would go to India and be highly influenced, not really make it back, but nevertheless. But we find that there is no credible evidence that this was transmitted from the Hindu tradition to the Greek that in a way that Aristotle would have understood it. So, this raises sort of an interesting question, and it's two questions ultimately. Where did Aristotle get the three laws of logic from? Right? Did they just fall from the sky? Did he find them under a rock? He turned a lot of rocks over. He liked to fish. He liked to pull a lot of fish. Did a fish whisper in his ear at some point the three laws of logic? And why would we also find them in the primary law in the Vedas? And the best answer we have, and this is something that I've written about a lot, is Aristotle was thinking in Greek. And the law of non-contradiction is prefigured in the grammar and logic of Greek linguistically, okay? And it's also prefigured in the logic and grammar of Sanskrit, Sanskrit being the language of the Vedas, and Greek and Sanskrit belong to the same family of languages, what we call the Indo-European family of languages, which should probably also include the Semitic family of languages, but which were excluded probably due to anti-Semitism of some type. But nevertheless, even the Semitic languages are close enough in some respects to the Indo-European family, either because they do share linguistic roots or because there was so many generations of intersharing between these cultures and civilizations. This may explain, for example, why Aristotle and Plato, for that matter, were so powerfully influential on the early Islamic scholars, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, whereas Al-Ghazali, who will oppose all philosophers, has a bit in common with Plato, nevertheless. So, any questions or concerns here? Okay, so we've already touched on this a bit. Non-contradiction of the law of thought opposes directly dialectics. We did, however, in 1265 with the Summa Theologica, we do have the return of Aristotelian thought. Now, one of the crazy things that happens in the West is that with Augustine, we have the rise of what we call Neoplatonism, And there's a tension between Neoplatonism and Aristotelian science and the logic underneath it. So for those of you who are familiar with the Christian tradition, you'll know that um, uh, Augustine takes a lot of the ideas and concepts from Plato to supplement what's lacking in the Bible to build a theology. But as he does this, as he is basically turning Plato into an important, Christian thinker, uh, um, and which by the way, Augustine's insight here is derived from his study of Paul, who writes, or at least disproportionately, the biggest part of the New Testament is attributed to Paul, and Paul's thinking is entirely consistent with Plato. So when Augustine realizes that, then he rationalizes that, okay, well, if Paul's hand was guided by God and Paul was guided by Plato, then Plato's hand was also guided by God. And so this is where we find the rise of Neoplatonism and Augustinian theology, which creates a tension or a conflict with Aristotle. Rome is already in trouble, of course, politically. But it's at this moment where Rome is teetering, where then it begins to ban and suppress Aristotelian thought, and this hastens Europe's decline into the Dark Ages. The light goes off, science, disappears, and so forth and so on. And so when in 1265, under the existential threat of Islam encroaching or invading up into Spain and knocking on the door in Vienna there soon or thereafter throughout the Balkans, this is when the church decides to try to find a way back. For Aristotle, that job is given to Aquinas, but what's interesting is he brings this very radical version of Aristotle that he takes from the Islamic scholars who were themselves already fighting a battle over the fate of Aristotle in the Islamic tradition. And so he brings this radical Aristotle into sort of this dialectic with this Platonic Augustinian theology. And it's not surprising that within a generation or two, that powerful radical version of Aristotle in the Summa is being used to deconstruct the church theology as a whole, which is going to lead to the further fragmenting of the Catholic notion of a connected world or empire under the direction of the Pope, and lead to the various nationalisms and the other things that will follow. Any questions or comments? So basically, I'm just summarized everything that's there. And since I'll just give you a moment to read it. I won't restate it. We'll take a break in 40 minutes. Now, Hegel, again, Hegel wants to correct Kant. And he says the law of identity is inaccurate because a thing is always more than itself. And the law of excluded middle is inaccurate because a thing can both be itself and many others. And the law of non-contradiction is accurate because everything in existence is both itself and not itself. Right? Now, the point that we should make here is that, in fact, Hegel saw these two logics as being both valuable and in a way complementary. Now, not all Marxists would, and especially Western Marxists, would agree with that. Okay, although you do have certainly the so-called analytical Marxists who hate the dialectic, and I think they're crazy, but you also have non-Marxists who say quite rightly that there's no Marxism without Aristotle. There's no Marxism without Kant. It was that strong scientific foundation and drive is essential for the scientific materialist qualities that we see in Marxism. And it's also fair to say that Hegel saw these two logics, what we call it, the analytic and the linear, and the dialectic, as being two different ways of thinking. And if you really want to bring your full intellectual capacity to a problem, you need to be able to look at the problem from both perspectives. Of course, the difference between Hegel and Marx is that Marx will emphasize the materialist side, whereas Hegel will emphasize spirit and consciousness. In other words, idealism over materialism. This is not to say that Hegel doesn't have any materialist basis or that there's nothing idealistic in Marx. And it's also arguably the case, as some have argued, that Marx is a little gracious to Hegel, but also he makes him a bit of a straw man as an idealist as well, so that he can more strongly assert his own materialist aspect. But we will come to a point here in a minute that I'll emphasize. So in order for us to really understand, again, we have Kant that says analytical and linear versus dialectical, and then we have Marx and Hegel, who will say, no, we need both forms. But you should understand that the triangle here, the top of the triangle should be dialect. There should be another label on top, dialectical. So the linear or the analytical form cannot tolerate the dialectical form of analysis, but the dialectical can tolerate contradiction. So in order to reconcile the contradiction between these two ways of thinking at the higher level of thought, you have to do so through the dialectic. Now, I'm sure all that seems rather abstract, but once we start talking about China and Chinese examples, it will be very clear, because we don't care about abstract things here. Now, in the Hegelian Marxist, Western Marxist, or classical Marxist, or Soviet Marxist tradition, we have the concept of the negation of the negation. And in a way, you can see a linear and a dialectical form here. So you have a thesis, which is, something, an idea, a concept, a practice. And then you have the antithesis or the antithesis, which is the opposite. And then in the Hegelian or the Marxist idea of the dialectic, there's a struggle between these two things. And they produce a synthesis, okay, and through that struggle. And then that synthesis becomes the new thesis. And then that attracts a new antithesis. And then there's a new struggle that produces a new synthesis. And it's through this movement through time where you make progress, but you make the progress by what Hegel and Engels and Lenin repeatedly emphasize is the negation of the negation. Now, here we come to Lenin, and I put a couple of texts by Lenin in the syllabus. Lenin, this is interesting because Lenin, this phrase, unity of opposites. So I want you to remember phrases like negation of the negation and unity of opposites. We raised unity of opposites previously when we were talking about Heraclitus. But Lenin will use this term specifically. And he explains that this embodies the essence of dialectics, but it requires explanations and development. So he goes on to explain that there are a lot of different aspects or conditions and circumstances that make up the totality of the unity of opposites, but central to them is a conflict. Okay? There's a conflict between this or that. There's a struggle between this or that. Okay? And what we need to do is make sure that the right side, or to put it in the correct term as a pun, the left side wins. Okay. Now, Stalin will reiterate this. And he'll reiterate this in 1938. And the thing that I want you to notice there is not simply what he reiterates, but the date, 1938. Okay. And that is 1 year after Mao published his two classics. This little book, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, published by Joseph Stalin. And what Stalin is doing is reiterating what Lenin and Engels said about dialectics. And the reason he's doing this is because Mao has said something different about dialectics. And this difference was noticed in Moscow. It was noticed in Moscow for two reasons. First, because it's different from what the Russians say, but also because Mao in 1937 is trying to push out what they call the Chinese Bolsheviks, who had previously been leading the party under Stalin's direction, the Chinese party. And so as he's consolidating his position, Moscow, of course, is very sensitive because they're finding their influence being diminished. So they're already very sensitive. So they're going to read the two classics very carefully, and they're going to notice that there's something different there. And they're going to criticize it. Stalin won't directly criticize Mao, but he will publish this book where he reasserts the orthodox line that comes from Engels and Lenin. Now, I want to just as a quick aside point out something that's useful to us. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Soren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, Danish philosopher. Kierkegaard was the scion of, it was the son and grandson of Lutheran ministers. We won't unpack what that means. But Protestantism, which tends to emphasize the individual relationship with God versus one mediated by the church, which is consistent with the rise of individualism and of course what we see with Calvin and what Weber will later describe as the Protestant work ethic, how that drives the development of capitalist nations for various reasons. Or what Durkheim will notice is the propensity of Protestants to commit suicide at a much higher rate than Catholics. All of these are things that we would indulge in long digressions if we had more time. But Kierkegaard was a hunchback. He had a physical deformity. He was frail. He was often sick, but he didn't have to work for a living, which is important. And he could devote his life instead to study. And he traveled to Germany from Copenhagen to take Hegel's course on dialectics. And he hated it, absolutely hated it. And he comes back to Copenhagen, and he writes his first book. And it's, it's a book that we now have to publish in 2 volumes because otherwise the binding wouldn't hold it, right? And it has this very, very strange title, Int and Eller, right? And he writes in Danish, which is, remarkable because there was only maybe 2 million people that spoke Danish at that time, and most of them were farmers who had no interest in esoteric philosophy, right? But because he's an existentialist, he has to write in his own native language. But the title is Either or, right? And he chooses this title as a repudiation of Hegel. He says Hegel's philosophy is the philosophy of and, the philosophy of and. Okay. In the modern world, we are faced with questions that are contingent on or. It's either this or that, not this and that, right? So he writes this book as a critique of Hegel, Hegel's philosophy of and. There are 2 points here as we move forward. The first is, compared to the way most Westerners think, Hegel's philosophy is qualitatively the philosophy of and. But we will see, I think, that ultimately Hegel is too influenced, as is Engels, possibly Marx, certainly Lenin and Stalin, by the culture of or that produced them. And what I want to point out is that if we have to reduce the law of non-contradictions to what the Russian linguist Voloshinov described as an ideologism, then we would say that the law of non-contradiction could be reduced to the expression of or, this or that, right? Not this and that. And I think when especially when you get to, say, the later Hegel, where later Hegel is less radical, later Hegel is very successful, and he has the king's ear. Hegel declares the end of history. This is the be all end all. Now that I've reached the top, history's reached the end point. Let's stop everything. Same thing the United States does with the collapse of Soviet Union, right? Okay, this is the end. We don't need to change anything. We like where things are now. Let's hold it here, right? And so there is this aspect, there is this sort of reductive dualism and even sort of an end of history tendency clearly that we see in Hegel, but also one could say we see this in the Soviet epistemologies as well. Okay. But to go back to the sort of the stronger analytic or linear form that drives Western society, I think we're now at the end point of 500 years of Western domination, but they had 500 years, and it's really being driven by this sort of binary, either or binary. And we can see it playing a role in economics, private property rights first. It's consistent. It's a logic consistent. So this again is the law of non-contradiction. We can see it underpinning private property rights, capitalism, liberalization. We can trace it as being partially responsible for cyclical crises. This is something Marx would note in his studies in Capital. Globalization, exploitation, class struggle. Politics, we see it as the operating logic of bourgeois liberal democracy, the fragmentation of the polis. In philosophy, linear logic, individualism, existentialism. In psychology, what we might call cogito consciousness, egocentrism, the phenomenon of alienation, schizoid behaviors, not schizophrenia, spectrum disorders through acculturation, not the genetically conditioned spectrum disorders, and what Marx would call fetishism or commodity fetishism, but one might even add sexual fetishism to that. And then in religion, Protestantism, salvation depends on personal relationship with God. Getting rich is a sign of God's grace, supplanting the divine right of kings. We see this in Calvin, Weber, and Durkheim in their analyses. And then ecological, the scientific and industrial revolutions, the Great Acceleration, the Anthropocene, climate change, global warming, desertification, extreme weather. Okay. All right. So before we transition to China, any questions? I hope this is better than Sunday school. Okay, so as I said to you earlier, we can use this term correlative thinking for or dialectics, or yin-yang way of thinking. Sometimes it's described as a form of holism. And we know that it was recast as dialectical materialism. Now here, we would point firstly to Lao Tzu. And Lao Tzu, to put it in the most direct terms, he doesn't use the expression unity of opposites, although we say his philosophy and that of Heraclitus are both consistent with the unity of opposites. Rather, being and no being generate each other. Okay? Being and no being generate each other. And it was they depend on each other. Okay? Now, I wouldn't say that this is the same concept that we see in Pierre Bourdieu's book Homo Academicus, where he talks about complicit adversaries. We're not necessarily talking about, antagonists who need each other. That's not the point. Now, in Mao, the expression that we're going to get is the unity of opposites, and this is a modern Chinese expression. And again, this term unity of opposites is not something that would have been expressed in pre-modern China as a specific phrase. I have talked to a number of scholars in China. Where does this term unity of opposites come from? And a lot of these Western terms were transitioned into China between 1895 and 1905. This is when the Chinese began to assimilate a lot of the Western knowledge, but via Japan, because Japan at that time was still using the Chinese characters. And so a lot of those terms, because after China's defeat to Japan in the Sino-Japanese War, this is a moment where a lot of Chinese go, okay, we got to figure something out. We have to modernize. We can't just repeat the dynastic cycle. We need a fundamental change. Clearly, Japan has figured that out because they just whipped our ass, and they're going to whip Russia's ass too. So we need to like figure out what they've got going on. So this is where you start to see the importation of a lot of Western words. For example, a lot of the words that have LOGY formulations in Chinese, these will be expressed as shui or study. We also use shui for school or other forms, but those are all coming through Japan. I don't know where the unity of opposites entered. I don't know if it entered through Japan or if it entered through the Chinese studies of Marxism. I haven't been able to trace that. but nevertheless, it is a modern term. I don't know precisely where it comes, but it is widely regarded in China as being consistent with Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu and Marx. Okay. But before we take that path, we need to do something else. We need to go back to the Shang Dynasty, which is by some accounts the first dynasty. And if there are Chinese people listening, and I know that they are, they would say, no, 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 no. The Shah Dynasty is the first. It's a matter of some scholarly debate. Certainly, there were very important Neolithic societies that predated the Shang. We have considerable archaeological evidence. But we don't learn of the Shah dynasty until the Zhou dynasty, and then they make up all of these, the names of all the kings and queens. And there is an argument that the Shah dynasty created the Zhou dynasty created the Shah dynasty in order to legitimize the transfer of the mandate of heaven from the Shang to the Zhou, because this was a very valuable concept that the Shang had created. And the Zhou wanted to argue, a dynasty can gain and they can also lose. And in this case, this historical record legitimizes us taking it from the Shang. So whether or not there was a Shah or not, what we do know is that it's in the middle to late part of the Shang dynasty where we have the emergence of Chinese writing as a formal system. Now, going back to the Neolithic period, we do see proto-writing. We see various symbols on pottery and other things, but there's no systemic form of writing. So here I need to take a moment and switch to a different share. One moment. Because the only way I could do this was by recording it on a video. Because if I try to project myself, it'll be backwards. And then under the pressure, I'll mess it up. And my handwriting's already really bad, so. So what we're looking at here will be back this up. So I don't know if you can see, and if I play it, I don't know if you can see and hear. If you can't hear it, yell at me. So what we're looking at here will be, firstly, an old character from the middle to late Shang period that would have looked something like this. And it's a pictograph of the millet plant, millet, or in Chinese, contemporary Chinese, xiaomi. This would have been the primary staple food during the Shang. They didn't have enough water to cultivate rice in that part of China at that time. And then this will evolve fairly quickly, something like this in the character, and this will be known as and today this word is still for grain. Now we can go to a second character where the will be the phoneme. And here what we see is two parts, one the ha, and the other part called yue. Now, in this case, if we were to draw this more formally in contemporary Chinese, we would know that this has been simplified as later, we should say later iterations. And then it'll be standardized as, and then it'll be formalized as here. And this word in Chinese, contemporary Chinese, means and, the conjunction and, and it also means harmony. Now, to go back and illustrate very quickly here, this part is three bamboo flutes pulled together, pitched differently, under a single mouthpiece. It's a type of instrument. And now I will continue to verbalize and explain this in the video. Were you able to catch that? So what's interesting is that this is, one could argue this is maybe the most important and one of the oldest characters of Chinese political philosophy in the Chinese tradition. And we do find it in the oracle bones, which were only rediscovered in the 1950s. Okay. I'm not going to get into how the oracle bones worked. It was a way to communicate with your dead relatives in heaven. It was really political theater to support the idea that the king was the son of heaven. But nevertheless, here we can see again the characters. And by the way, if you those of you who use Pinyin and have the ability to type Chinese, if you type "he" and you scroll through long enough, you'll find the old form of it. And when you're in Beijing, you'll see the old form and the Shang form around the city, because it is a central concept that the government still promotes. But the idea here is that in an agrarian society, the number one thing that you need in order to have harmony is food. Right? The number one thing that would destabilize a society and lead it into crisis would be hunger. Okay. So, and also in ancient China, the character that was, let's say, considered the most essential or that was being privileged in the concept, it was the one that was given the privilege of being the phoneme or being allowed to give the sound of the character. So in this case, "he," or at that time the millet plant, is the starting point. But in order, over here we have this musical instrument, and so we'll tell a couple of stories here. The first is there was a tradition, and again, Confucius will come much later out. He doesn't even know if the Shang existed in terms of how they existed. He thinks he has a very different idea. He doesn't know how characters have changed or where they come from. In fact, they create sort of this idealistic study of characters that really gets a little disconnected from reality, where they're sort of imposing Confucian values on the characters to explain them. But it is interesting in so much as Confucius was once asked by a student, if you only had time to study one of the classics, one of the classic works that Confucius said you should study if you want to learn the art of governance. He says, in that case, you should study the book of songs, or what we call the book of poetry, because at least then you would learn the principle of harmony, and that this was the most important characteristic or most important quality for a leader. Now, so here what we see is a musical instrument that is combining three different sounds to create three different pitched flutes to create that harmonious sound. There's another saying in Chinese that you can't create a tasty soup from water alone. You have to find the right combination of the four flavors, right? So it's about finding and combining differences in a way that make or create harmony. So in order to lead and produce a society that is capable of producing grain surpluses, which society needs to survive, you need to have social harmony. But in order to have social harmony, you need to have food. So there's this double relationship, a dialectical relationship between these two sides. And then, of course, what's interesting is the character literally means harmony, but it also literally means and, okay? So here we can already begin to see like the unity of differences or the unity of opposites even, and how these things must come together in a productive way in order to create, you have to find that harmony between differences in order to create um, uh, the possibility for social progress. Now, of course, we'll see this, evolving idealistically into the I Ching, which is really sort of it's a very interesting thing, and I'm not denigrating it, but it is largely sort of a pseudoscience, an idealist pseudoscience. There are some interesting insights. Some of them are based on some materialist conceptions, but it also is highly formalistic and imaginary. But here's from Hall and Ames. And again, I said they don't like the word dialectic. They use correlative thinking. So they say what has come to be called correlative thinking is effectively a non-logical procedure in the sense that it is not based upon natural kinds, part-whole relations, an implicit or explicit theory of types, or upon causal implications or entailments of anything like the sort one finds in Aristotelian or modern Western logics. Rather, correlative thinking employs analogical associations. Okay. Now, if we had time, I would give you a powerful example. I would deconstruct um, uh, Zhao Yang, your last name Wong is the normal Wong, the usual Wong.
No, it's about water
Okay, all
with
right. So
water.
not your name, but normally if you were a Wong, it would be the 1, 2, 3, right? The 4 strokes. So usually when I'm teaching this in China to either my Chinese or Western students, we would deconstruct that character and its relationship to tigers and its relationship to Confucian etymology to demonstrate the analogical association, but I think it's a little far afield for us here. So what I'm acknowledging is it's a little abstract, but the key point is the logic and the way that they think is not like what you find in the West. It's different. Okay? So the relative difference of correlative thinking to logical analysis means that ambiguity, vagueness, and incoherence associable with images and metaphors are carried over into the more formal elements of thought. In contradistinction to the rational mode of thinking, which privileges univocity, correlative thinking involves the association of elements into image clusters which guarantee to its constituents richly vague significance. All right. Now, 2 points here. Hall and Ames sound like they're being insulting, but they are not. They are being very kind from a Western point of view. All right. They're being kind from Western. And Hall and Ames are sinologists of the first rank in the Western tradition. Hall is dead now. Ames, the last time I saw him was at Beida. He'd been at the University of Hawaii most of his career. I haven't seen him since COVID actually, so I don't know if he's still with us, but he's an older man, and they are in no means by no means are they being insulting to China here. Though the first time I read that, I go, man, that's a little harsh. But they were translators of Lao Tzu and many others, so they do have some sensitivity here. But I think the key point is that it's very difficult in English to describe the difference in Chinese thought and not have it sound like an insult. Because English language itself is part of the Indo-European family of languages and is also constructed and privileges the law of non-contradiction in the way that it's so it's almost impossible to really say or explain this difference in a sweet way in English. Much easier to do it in Chinese, and certainly classical Chinese. Now, I know this will seem a little simplistic, but we'll quickly explain this before we move on to a short break. A lot of Westerners find this image very attractive, right? They find it attractive, but it's also the case they find it attractive for the wrong reason. Western thought tends to be dualistic, it tends to be binary, it tends to be either or. And so they tend to see this as, you know, those two sides, they tend to see it from a binary perspective. And the way that you should, I don't know if any of you are fans of Vietnamese coffee. Any of you drink Vietnamese coffee, and you know how they put the heavy sweetened condensed milk in the bottom of the cup, and then they slow drip the heavy black coffee on top. What you should imagine is that you have because you know Sunday morning you're in a boring class. You should imagine that you've got a really nice cup of Vietnamese coffee right now, right? And you got a little spoon, and you've put that spoon down in the bottom, and now you've pulled that heavy cream up to the top, right? That's one of my favorite things to do in life. I'm a simple person, right? You pull that up, and you see that white against the black. And then what do? You stir it, right? And what you see here in this symbol is the stir. So imagine that you're looking down on a cup of coffee with heavy cream in it, right? And so this is the key point. Lao Tzu and the ancient Chinese understood that we, all people, have a tendency to see things in black or white, or to see things in male or female or binary terms. But don't do that. Don't do it. You need to understand that the white is not really white. The black isn't really black. Rather, they are mixing, and the reality of the world is ever shifting shades of gray. You think you see black and white, but that's not reality. Okay, reality is much more complicated. And so that's the true message of this symbol. So it's not to say that the ancient Chinese didn't recognize either or, but rather they were constantly training themselves and reminding themselves to view themselves and the world holistically. Okay, holistically. All right. If there are not any questions, we'll take a little break and we'll come back in. I still have a lot to do, so let's make it. I think we originally agreed 10 minutes, but maybe if you come back sooner, good.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's very interesting so far. I'm gonna ask an impossible question, I guess, but I hope perhaps people who speak Chinese or who were living in China for a while can answer that question. But is it let's say complicated concept or notion to understand as Westerners and because of the language we speak, or is it also inherently vague and ambiguous for people who speak Chinese? Because I remember I lived in Taiwan for a while, and I remember people saying that it's a lot of guessing in conversations, that there's a lot of sort of like things to figure out that are not implicit. And I just wonder if this is something that is inherent to, for us, for example, for me as a white person, to not be able to understand because of the language I speak and I have been cultured, or is it just something that is inherently part of the language and that everybody has to navigate?
Well, I'll take a crack at answering that, and it's kind of a complicated answer. So one of the things that native Chinese, at least native, maybe less so people born in the 90s and the 2000s, what we call the Zhou Ho and the Ling Ho, who've really been more acculturated to Western ways of thinking, and the Western technologies that go along with these ways of thinking and culture. But you do see in this generation of scholars that that were born in the 60s and the 70s, that ended up going to the West to get a PhD or to study, or began to emulate Western styles of argumentation in their academic essays, that they were very conscious that they lost something, that that they gained a much stronger argument, but they lost poetry and meaning, so that there was a trade-off, so that you could convey a lot of things and a lot of different meanings and values, but it would be a lot fuzzier. Or you could take the Western approach, and again, if you studied formal rhetoric, or if you know like the standard essay in English, it's very much based on the you know you through a hyper rational, hyper logical argumentation structure. Now, there were studies done, I think, in the 60s and 70s. They're a little controversial. The name of the author is escaping me right now, where he said that in different languages, you can see that argumentation can be graphed in different ways. So he said, for example, in the Sino-Tibetan form of argumentation, we tend to move in a circle. That we move around and around and around and around and around in a circle to make a point. Whereas, in the West, it's this. So you state your thesis, you give the evidence to support your thesis. If you're generous, you raise the counter thesis or the counter argument so you can dismiss it, and then your conclusion is basically a restatement of your thesis. So it's a very straight line Aristotelian rhetorical form. And a lot of Chinese will tell you, again, at least Chinese of a certain generation, that, so for example, if I write an essay and I write it in Chinese, or I translate an essay I wrote in English into Chinese, even if the Chinese is really, really good, they can tell that it's based on a Western style. In other words, they can discern that difference. It's that clear to them. And it was an issue about 10 to 15 years ago, that there were some scholars who really favored the Western style, and they were either admired or criticized for using that style, especially when they were talking about China or Chinese tradition or Chinese values. So I think that the final point to raise to answer your question is that there is a cultural context. So I know that I've lived in China for 20 years. I raised my kids here as a single parent. That meant I had to deal with, I got married here, I got divorced here. When you have to deal with Chinese schools, you have to deal with the Chinese government, when you're working and all of these things, you experience a type of cultural immersion that is, adding layers and layers of cultural meaning. And what's interesting is that in the West, I think we pretend it's fake, but we pretend, for example, that culture and relationships that are culturally structured are irrelevant. They're always relevant. We just hide it. Okay. Whereas in China, we never suffer from that illusion. We always realize that culture and relations are always preeminent. So I think, you know, in this sense, even if you spoke the language well, if you didn't know the culture, if you weren't immersed in the culture enough, you would still be missing nuances or cultural meaning that don't have to be communicated directly, and rarely are communicated directly, but are always communicated. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, no, thank you. It's very interesting because I had friendship and romantic relationship with people in Taiwan, and it was just always such an interesting conversation, right, about forwardness and directness. And I think,
well, yeah, I'll add one point to this that I always found very, very strange is that I would have conversations with people, with really, intelligent people who could dialogue with me in Chinese or English. And if you were having a conversation with them in Chinese about a topic, you would reach a certain conclusion. But if you had the same conversation with them in English, you would reach a different conclusion. That was the way in which they were processing and moving through the language would literally lead them to different outcomes. Okay. And I tried to theorize this some years ago in a paper where I used W.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, where he's explaining the challenge of being African American in a white dominated society in the United States in the early 1900s, and how you have to know the Black world, but you also have to know the white world in order to survive in it. But you also know that the white world doesn't really understand the Black world, and is in fact misrepresenting the Black world. So how do you know the white world, but also your more immediate cultural experience? So I would suggest that there was that at least up until a certain generation, there was sort of not there was sort of these two sort of sides where people were sort of struggling sometimes to inhabit two different positions simultaneously, which were sometimes in conflict with each other. But they could do that because they were Chinese, and the contradiction wasn't something that really terrified them the way it might terrify maybe someone in the West. But I don't sense this is the same with the younger generations, starting with the Zhou Ho and the Ling Ho that grew up more in the market society, acculturated by Western soft power and and the products of people with autism spectrum disorder, like social media and video games and so forth and so on. All right, let's take a quick break, and then we'll continue. And if you have any questions, we'll come back to them. And if we have to extend what we're talking about to the next class, that's fine.
thank you.
Okay. So, we sometimes we ask the question, who came first, Kongzi or Lao Tzu, Confucius or Lao Tzu? And the answer is, we don't even know if Lao Tzu was a real person. Because Lao Tzu is not a name. It's just old master, okay? And there is a tradition in Chinese philosophy of people creating old masters in order to argue against new masters. Zhuangzi, who is, after Lao Tzu, the most significant Taoist philosopher, argues, and there is a compelling argument that I won't get into, but there's a compelling argument to support his position, which is Lao Tzu is the true ancient thought of China. And then, and we can see like ideas that are consistent with Lao Tzu at work in the characters that are being shaped, like the character we saw for and or harmony during the Shang Dynasty. We can see it consistent with the I Ching and these other classics that Confucius himself will point to and say, okay, yes, these are classics. So we can see that the thought that we describe as being the thought of Lao Tzu is in fact very old. It's likely, however, that it wasn't formally written down as the Tao Te Ching until later. And possibly in reaction to Kongzi, in reaction to Confucius. Because where we really start to see the discussion of Lao Tzu's position is as a critique of Confucian thought. So as Confucian thought begins to develop in the spring and autumn period, ahead of the Warring States period, and after the collapse of the Zhou dynasty, you see that there are a number of critics, and we call these critics, we begin to identify these critics as being Taoist. And what's interesting is the criticism that the Taoists raise against Confucian thought has a powerful impact on the development of Confucian thought. We see that Confucian thought begins to accommodate and adjust itself to some extent to try to defend itself, but also strengthen itself in ways that if the Taoists are pointing out something legitimate that they that are indeed culturally relevant, that the Confucians tend to adapt. But the point that we want to make here is that Zhuangzi is probably right. Lao Tzu is an expression, a formal expression of the true ancient thought. That ancient thought was already present in Kongzi's works, but Kongzi was also developing something new, but the extent to which he was considered to deviate too far from that traditional thought was the extent to which that traditional thought in turn disciplined the development of Confucianism. However, in the Book of Rites, and I provide a passage from the Book of Rites, there's a very famous passage. And again, if we were teaching this in class here, we would spend about an hour talking about the curious fact that most of the Book of Rites is Kongzi struggling over his inability to describe the correct funeral ritual and why that's the case. It's a very interesting story as it relates to what we're talking about, but it's again something too far afield. what's directly relevant here is this passage that I provided you, where it describes Kongzi pacing back and forth, kind of on a balcony, and one of his students says, "What's troubling you, master?" And he says, "I regret that I did not get to live to witness Datong, or the Great Harmony." And he goes into this long exposition in the ancient times, the ancient kings, the ancient sages. They created Datong, they created the Great Harmony. And he describes what all the conditions were of that time. And it sounds really like a socialist fantasy. It sounds like a communist utopian dream, everything that he describes. And he says, that period has fallen into disrepair, and we now live in a period of relative chaos. And what we need to do in order to return to Datong is we need to slowly start practicing the right rituals, following, and ritual here, or li in the Chinese context, it could mean literally ringing the bell at a certain way, or placing your house in the right direction according to feng shui, or preparing the soup the right way, or following the right ritual of leaving something for your dead ancestors on certain key holidays. But it also means sort of the technologies of how you take care of yourself and your society. It's sort of a type of wisdom and knowledge of how you manage society. And so in this way, ritual can also mean sort of technologies of governance in a way. So he says what we need to do is reestablish, we need to start building this and try to reestablish or establish a Shaokong society, or Shaokong Shuhui. And this is in the old English translation that I gave you, it's called a society of small comforts, right? Or in contemporary Chinese Marxism, it's a moderately well-off or moderately prosperous society. And according to Chinese Marxism, China achieved a Shaokong Shuhui, I think, in 2020 or 2021. And what the idea is, okay, we need to slowly redevelop, and the Chinese don't, the modern Chinese Marxists don't say ritual, but we need to establish order, and we need to slowly develop. And once we get our development stage to a certain level, then we will achieve a Shaokong, so a moderately prosperous, which in contemporary Chinese vernacular would be not a middle class society, because that would fall into the Chinese, or excuse me, the capitalist terminology of class, but a society where the majority, or not the majority, but a critical mass of people qualify as middle income. Right. So presently, China has 400 million middle income people in the country, larger than the entire population of the United States. And it has achieved a level where, according to national officials at least, they've eliminated extreme poverty, and they are working to, they've lifted 700 million people out of poverty. They've eliminated extreme poverty. We still have poverty, but they're working. So they say this is consistent with a middle income country. By IMF standards, this would also be valid. But the idea is that in order to reach a Shaokong society, you have to prioritize your contradictions, and you have to manage them to reestablish a threshold of order. And then once you break through to that point, then you can start to prioritize the higher order development goals that will then lead you to Datong Shuhui, or socialism, or maybe communism. But we can see the concept of Datong still playing a major role in Chinese thinking about how to solve the crises of modernity. In the late 1800s, you have the Datong Shu, for example, as a powerful influence. And some critics of Mao Zedong would say he tried to move too directly to Datong. And then Deng Xiaoping introduces the idea of the Xiaokong Shui as something that we have to establish first before we can move on to a more robust form of socialism. But the point that I want to make here is that even here, where Confucius is being much more Confucian than Taoist, we can see the dialectic at work, and it's a materialist dialectic, in so much as we have to progressively deal with contradictions in society in order to achieve higher levels of social development. Now we come to Chan Buddhism, and here I want to take a few minutes and make a very important digression. I posted or it was posted for me in the folder, the Book of Tea by Kakuzo Okakura, Japanese man. I think the book was published in 1906, if my memory serves. And this was a book. Kakuzo Okakura was a very interesting person because he was growing up and going to school in Japan when Japanese development, modern development, was accelerating, and on the eve of Japan fighting and defeating China, which is an existential crisis for China, and what's interesting is that his father forced him to go to two schools at the same time. So he had to go to a traditional Japanese school at one point of the day, and the other part of the day he had to go to a modern Western school. And so he became highly conversant, and he was also gifted in languages. He became highly conversant in traditional culture and modern Western culture. And he was perfectly fluent in English. And he ends up getting a job, I think, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I think working in a museum or something. And he's constantly being asked, can you explain the difference between Eastern and Western thought? And so he writes the Book of Tea, to illustrate this. And he focuses in the Book of Tea on the tea ceremony or the tea ritual to provide an example of this difference. But he says, if you really want to go to where the fundamental difference can be found, or where it originates, you go to Lao Tzu. All right, you go to Lao Tzu, and then you look at Zen Buddhism, Zen. Okay. Now, it's interesting that we have a Japanese scholar saying, if you want to understand the difference between East and West, you have to start with Lao Tzu. And it's also interesting that he mentions Zen. And certainly there are elements in Zen that play out in the tea ceremony that help illustrate differences. But there is, in fact, a deeper reason why we should look at Zen. And Okakura doesn't elaborate this, and I'm not sure whether he knows it, but I know it, so we'll explain it. Right? Here's the difference. Buddhism originates in India, and when it originally spread to China, it found some people who embraced it, but it was not something that spread wide and far. It was very limited to a select group of people. Why is this? Well, Siddhartha is coming from the Hindu tradition. He's thinking and writing in Sanskrit. And if you know the story of Siddhartha, you know that he experiences what we would otherwise describe in contemporary language. He experiences an existential crisis. He's forced to face the difficulties, the disappointments of the world after being sheltered. And this is an overwhelming experience for him. And he, according to the story, he sits under, he goes into almost like a catatonic state under a banyan tree and meditates. And he is really trying to solve the problem of his own existence. His solution ultimately, and this is, I'm going to present this from the Confucian position, his solution, and the Buddhist would reject this characterization, but the Confucian interpretation of his solution is that you must abandon the self in order to save the self. And the Confucians say, we agree you should abandon the self, but it's illogical that you would abandon the self so that you could save the self. Now, what's interesting is that if you know Chinese, some of you are Chinese and some of you have spent time in Taiwan, you probably know the Chinese word for I, wo. But what's interesting is that the Chinese word for I did not originally mean first person singular pronoun I. And as if you know the character for war, you know that the radical in the character is a weapon. And that character war originally meant members of the king's guard. So if you were war, it meant you were a member of the king's guard. You were not the king. The king had his own pronoun, which was also not singular, but included him and his ancestors in heaven. All right. So although people certainly had a concept of being individuals, an individual being, in language and culture, individualism was not emphasized. Rather, there was more of a collective understanding of being. And this is, again, I teased you a little bit, whether you realized it or not, when I said that Kongzi struggles to give us a funeral ritual in the Book of Rites. This is because there's no one ritual, because every ritual has to be tailored to the person, not because that person is an individual, but because that person is a unique component of our collective being. And we have to collectively have a ritual that deals with our collective grief for losing part of our being. So, for example, when a family member dies or when the king's son dies, part of us died, part of our collective being died. And so we're not having a ritual for him who is dead, but the part of us that is dead. But how we recognize and deal with that grief is strangely individualistic, whereas the way that they deal with it in the Islamic tradition or the Christian tradition or the Jewish tradition it's all the same, because the ritual is actually for the dead person, which is always separate from you, in a weird way. So there's a little irony there. Anyway, the point is that the ancient Chinese, who had understood that there was wisdom and value in Buddhism, they understood that even though the Chinese did not necessarily conceptualize themselves as individuals the way Siddhartha did, this did not mean that they did not have individual problems. And in Buddhism, what you gain are some critical insights, some wisdom that help you deal with these kinds of problems. So in order to make Buddhism more meaningful and useful to the Chinese, they Sinicized it. And the way they Sinicized it is that there was a school of Buddhism called the Huayan School of Buddhism, and they took the Lotus Sutra from India and they interpreted using Laozi's thought. And this is how Buddhism was then assimilated by combining it with yin-yang thought. The Huayan school would then be suppressed, but it would, from its remains, we would see the development of what is called Chan Buddhism. And Chan is what the Japanese call Zen. Okay. So interestingly, you had this thought that came from the same culture that produced the law of non-contradiction before Aristotle produced it, that had a more robust understanding of the individual and was therefore more vulnerable to individual existential crises. In order for that thought to really take root and be meaningful and significant for a larger number of Chinese people, it had to be Sinicized, which means it had to be assimilated via the yin-yang way of thinking. Okay. Now, the other point that there are a couple other points to make from Kokuzo Kokura. The first is he says, if you want to understand the fundamental difference between the East and the West, in the East, we understand being as, quote, being in the world, hyphenated, being in the world. Whereas in the West, you conceptualize it as a dualism or an egocentric form of being. He says, however, Japan has become so Western in recent times that we can no longer sharply distinguish between Japan and the West. Right? Now, it's interesting then that when we come to Marxism, the introduction of Marxism, we begin to see some early Marxist texts coming into China via Japan as early as 1905, but we won't begin to see real serious study until after the May 4th movement in 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles gives the former German concession of Shandong to the Japanese, contrary to promises to return it to China, which therefore expands the Japanese foothold on the mainland and will position them for greater troublemaking. So we had a number of schools. It's one of these periods that we describe with the colloquialism of 100 schools. Let 100 flowers bloom. Let 100 schools of thought contend. And so there are many of these periods in Chinese history. One of them produced Kongzi and Laozi and others. And in this case, in 1919, 1920, 1921, and so forth and so on, we have a new 100 schools period. And so you have people like Mao Zedong and Li Dajiao at Beida Tushuguan studying Marxism. You have another group under Hu Shi studying John Dewey and pragmatism, and all these little, and you have some groups that are following what will emerge in Japan as a form of fascism, although fascism, narrowly speaking, emerges first in Italy, and then, develops its grotesqueries there and beyond. But there is sort of a Japanese version of fascism. And certainly we see these elements gaining power in the Blue Society of the Kuomintang. Nevertheless, when you have Li Dajiao and Mao Zedong in the Marxist study group in Peking University, one of the things that they encounter in Marxism is the dialectic. And they immediately gravitate to the Marxist dialectic because they find in it something that resonates with traditional Chinese culture. And the problem at that time, what some scholars have called the crises of Chinese consciousness there in the May 4th and post May 4th period, is how do we change ourselves so that we can survive the modern world without destroying ourselves? So how can we preserve who we are and what we value, without, say, changing ourselves the way the Japanese did, where we essentially have to destroy ourselves in order to survive. And so this is what these various groups are really sort of struggling with. And in the Marxist study group, they believe that one way to accomplish this is through Marxism. And they're attracted to Marxism as I've said, in part because of the dialectic, which they think they can map in some constructive way to yin yang thought. But also, this is when Lenin is consolidating the October Revolution, and now Marxism has credibility as a viable alternative, right? And so it's now a candidate because of the success or the relative success of the October Revolution. And then they're also seeing the dialectic and going, okay, this is something we can work with. Now, are there any questions before we continue? So let's get to our key concerns. So in 1937, Mao writes on contradiction and on practice. Now, 1937, whenever you're thinking as a Marxist does, and when you're always leading with politics, as Mao is, the first thing you have to do is historicize. You have to ask yourself, what are the historical conditions and what are the political circumstances that are propelling him to write and say what he's doing? Okay, so what's interesting is 1937. 1937 is, as you know, a year after 1936. And 1936 is significant because that's the year that we had what is called the Xi'an incident. And the Xi'an incident is when Chiang Kai-shek, or in Chinese, Jiang Jieshi, was captured in Xi'an and forced to initiate the Second United Front with the CPC to fight together against the Japanese. Now, we need to back up a little bit and say, in 1921, the CPC was formed in Shanghai. Mao was there, but he was not a key leader. There were a couple of representatives from Comintern, the Communist International, who came down to sort of oversee the formation of the party. When that happened, the Soviet line began to take precedence in the CPC. And what we can describe as the Mao line, which was directly influenced by Li Dajiao, is sort of pushed to the side. The key difference between the Soviet line and the Li-Mao line is that Li and Mao both advance the idea of the peasant-worker alliance. Now, as I said earlier, both Mao and Li are peasants. And in classical Chinese Marxism, peasants are not supposed to be progressive. They're not supposed to be capable of leading society into a revolution, into a progressive revolution. They are considered too backward. And this value was something that the Soviets had also kept to. And it's one of the reasons why we see such a terrible suppression of the peasants by the Soviets. As peasants, Li and Mao had a very different perspective, but Mao and Li also understood that peasants had in the past played important revolutionary roles, and that there was probably something different about Chinese peasants from Western or even Russian peasants, in so much as the density and the organizational structure meant that there was a different quality and characteristic to them. But what we can see is that there is already a strange contradiction. There's already, I'm going to use the Chinese word, there's already a Maodun. The Maodun is, or the contradiction is the peasant and the worker. Okay, and these two things were conceptualized in Marxism, classical Marxism, as being antagonistic to each other, are now going to form an alliance. Mao gets sidelined, Li gets killed, and the Chinese Bolsheviks are basically running the show. And in 1920, and so the key, the earlier point is that, was it 1924, 23, 24, 25, so someone remembers better than I. Sun Zhongshan, or in English, Sun Yat-sen, had approached the Soviet Union for support because the Kuomintang was in a mess. And the Soviet Union agreed to support the Kuomintang and help transform the Kuomintang into a Leninist party. So it won't be a Marxist-Leninist party, but it will be a Leninist party, which means it will use the techniques of Leninist political discipline. And in this way, the Kuomintang will be able to discipline itself and hopefully begin to clean up its corruption and create a more meaningful form of governance. China was again in disarray. But the Soviet Union conditions this support on the Kuomintang making the CPC a junior member of government. And Sun Zhongshan, who leans to the left, he's not a leftist, but he leans to the left, okay? He accepts this condition, and then you have the CPC that's in government with, CPC is very small, but it's in government, it's in a coalition government with the Kuomintang. Unfortunately, Sun Zhongshan will die of cancer in 1925, and control of the Kuomintang will fall to Chiang Kai-shek or Chiang Kai-shek, who leans to the right. And by 1927, he will break the United Front and start attacking and killing and encircling the Chinese communists. And this will lead to maybe a 90% loss in the party. And the people who survive are the people who are following Mao's line in the countryside. And then I'm not going to go through the whole history of the Jiangxi Soviet and how it gets encircled and how they break out. And then they go to the Junyi Conference. And this is where Zhou Enlai breaks with the Chinese Bolsheviks and backs Mao Zedong. And that's when Mao Zedong takes control of the party. And then they continue the long march up to Yan'an. And then in 1936, you have the Xi'an incident where Chiang Kai-shek is captured. And the party can decide what to do with him. And many in the party want to kill him because he killed a lot of them. And the Chinese leadership under the CPC leadership under Mao says, no, we're not going to kill him. We're going to create a second united front. And a lot of people don't like this idea. The contradiction, the unity of opposites couldn't be more clear. And yet Mao says, no, we're going to combine. This is what's in the interest of the nation. This is what's in our interest. So this is what we're going to do. And so when Mao is writing on contradiction and on practice in 1937, as I said to you before, the first thing he's doing is he's trying to validate his line distinct from the Soviet or the Chinese Bolshevik line, which was discredited because of the poor way in which they handled the struggle ultimately with the Kuomintang. So he's distinguishing his way of thinking from them, and this is going to necessitate embracing a unity of opposites that includes himself, in other words, the peasant and the worker, all right? And it's going to include the CPC and the Kuomintang cooperating with each other. Now, when Mao writes on contradiction, he cites in the first sentence the unity of opposites. Where is it? Maybe the slide fell out. He cites straight away the unity of opposites. Now there are 2 points here. When he cites unity of opposites, we can find this same phrase in Lenin, and he's citing Lenin. But when we go and we read Lenin, we understand that when Lenin is talking about the unity of opposites, he's talking about a fundamental conflict, this or that. And when we read Mao, even though he's citing Lenin, his concept of unity of opposites has more in common with Lao Tzu. However, in the early editions of On Contradiction, he also includes other Marxist phrases like negation of the negation, which is a concept that we take from Hegel, but it's really expounded on by Engels and the Dialectics of Nature, and then by Lenin and Stalin. And Engels will give us the 3 laws of the dialectic. What we will see as Mao goes through time is that he's saying, actually, the 3 laws, according to Engels, the only one that is valid is the unity of opposites. Negation of negation, it doesn't exist. He says, instead, we have to have affirmation and negation. As we have to embrace the difference. Now, if you know enough about Chinese history, you'll go, wait a minute, didn't he lead, a struggle? Didn't he ultimately vanquish the Kuomintang? Didn't he embark on class struggle? And wasn't this an either or exercise? The answer is yes and no. And we'll have to unpack that probably in the next class. But what's interesting is when he publishes this in 1937, Stalin responds, as I said, by going back and reasserting the Leninist line that was adapted from Engels. And the Soviet Marxist scholars are accusing Mao of being a primitive Taoist dialectician. So they know where he's coming from. And even though he's embellishing his texts with negation of the negation and other Soviet Marxist terms, in fact, starting in the late 50s and then in the 60s, Mao will have all of those removed from the official version of the law from On Contradiction, and he will repeatedly emphasize again and again here, and you can see this in these were the 3 laws that come from Engels that get repeated by Lenin and Stalin. And then Mao in his, and it's a little difficult to read even in English, but in his talk on questions on philosophy, he repudiates Engels. He says the only thing is the unity of opposites. There's no such thing as the negation of the negation. Rather, it should be affirmation, negation, affirmation, negation. And I think we'll have to come back to this next week. But in order to sort of close for today, what I would argue is that if you had to come up with an ideologism that expresses the fundamental difference between China and the West, it would be simply the difference between and or. And if you really wanted to understand where you see the distinction between Chinese Marxism and Soviet or Western Marxism, it's that even in the Western and the Soviet Marxism, where they're trying to advance a concept of the unity of opposites, it's still a unity of opposites that is contingent on an or relationship. And it's only where we see this direct influence of Lao Tzu in the power of correlative thinking and Yang thought in the Chinese tradition, where the unity of opposites is being tethered to that traditional concept. And the final point here, and again, we'll come back to this, and when we get to Xi Jinping, is that Xi Jinping a year or so ago introduced a concept called the two combinations. And what he said is Chinese Marxism was always already a combination of traditional thought and Marxism. And since then, Chinese Marxism has continuously gone back to the Western tradition, but also gone back to the Chinese tradition to further enrich Chinese Marxism as a critical theoretical discourse that can guide effective governance in today's world. So let's leave off with that and entertain any questions that you have for the moment.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Mahoney. Gabrielle?
Hello, thanks,
Hello.
Professor, for your exposition. I do have a question about this influence of Lao Tzu, this whole problem, which is like I do think that we do have a very strong, as you said, development of this correlative thinking or dialectical thinking in Chinese thought that goes with the Chan Buddhism, but somehow I see that we read Lao Tzu through the comments of let's say 1B or the neo, which we call in the West as neo-Confucian thinkers, as Zhou Dongyi, who elaborates the Tai Chi too, and so on. So would you think that it's a Taoist influence, or we can say of a neo-Confucianist, of the Tao Shui influence, or we can, or should we track it to this very old Taoist line, or do we have to, can we track it to some more modern neo-Confucianist thinking?
Well, I think the first thing that, so the way I understand your question, it's a good question, but the problem with the question is that the Chinese tradition, although we can point to specific schools and we can label specific schools, the tradition as a whole tends to be syncretist. In other words, there's a blending, right? And I remember in some lecture at some point, some talk, I don't recall, someone was saying that that the Chinese concept of the soul is like a diamond with many facets. There are many sides to it. And so the Chinese, you know, they can appreciate Jesus, but they can also appreciate Buddha, they can appreciate Kongzi, that there are many different aspects of being, but we don't have to strictly reconcile these in some sort of overall, exclusive or hyper rational way. So I would say that there's this tendency to cherry pick, to go back and just to find, okay, this was useful. And I'll give you an example. And again, it's something we'll talk about in a later class, where China now, for a number of reasons, is completely committed to cultivating an ecological society. And to support this, Xi Jinping went back to the first principle of Taoism, which is to promote harmony between people and nature. Right? So this is a classical Taoist first principle. And we can see this certainly in the Tao Te Ching, but we can also see it in Zhuangzi. Okay. But he's adopted that, he's brought that and adapted that in and made it now a central value in Chinese Marxism. So, and again, he's underscoring this by saying, we've always done this through the two combinations. So I think that there is just this tendency to take what you need from the buffet of Chinese tradition. They go, okay, this is what I need to help me rationalize and solve this problem. But that's not to say that it doesn't follow a certain type of logic or for a certain type of value, right? It can be contingent and it can change. And by the way, you just reminded me that there was a slide that I should have shown that I'm going to jump back to right quick because I think it really will better explain something, even though it digresses from your key question, which I don't want to neglect. But if you want to look at, excuse me. So if you want to look at examples of this Chinese concept of this and dialectics in practice, Peasant Worker Alliance, if you read On Contradiction, the way he drills out the idea of the primary or principal contradiction. We've mentioned the Second United Front. The mass line is a concept I haven't introduced, but it's contention on this idea of this and dialectic. We'll talk later about the Cultural Revolution. There's a major contradiction in the Cultural Revolution, in so much as workers are sent down, students are sent down to learn from the countryside, but of course most of them are put to work teaching peasants how to read and write, and this is where China sees its huge upsurge in literacy, especially female literacy. And then, of course, in the middle of this supposed leftist excess is when Mao is opening to the United States and moving to the right. So how do we understand this double movement, right? This is something that would be perfectly sensible to Mao, even in the way that he strategically elevates the left in the cities to knock down the right and then sends everybody to the countryside, so that he then has a free hand to open to the United States. And then why he does this, right? All of this is consistent with this sort of unity of opposites way of thinking. His three-world theory, which was introduced by Deng Xiaoping at the United Nations in 1974, the concept of the socialist market economy is an and construction. One country, two systems is an and construction. If you know how special economic zones worked and how they implemented these policies and built them and then expanded them, that's an and. Jiang Zemin's theory of the three represents, fundamentally based on Chinese dialectics. The same thing with Hu Jintao's harmonious society concept. We mentioned harmony between people and nature, which was something Xi Jinping has brought to the fore. Certainly his concept of a multipolar world is based on this idea of an and logic, as well as his called for a shared future, these win-win schemes, GCI, GGI, GDI, GSIBR, blah, blah, blah. Another thing is last year during the third plenum, they flipped they inverted the relationship. So for a long time, the mantra was we need to reform so China can open up. But as of last year, we flipped it. So we say, okay, now we need to open up more to drive our reforms. So our reforms reached a certain plateau. So and to give you the practical example, EVs. So by making China completely open to any EV company that wants to bring state-of-the-art to China, and this is now going to force Chinese EV companies to compete with the very best. And so that opening up will drive the reform of our industry. So in the past, we had to like reach a certain level. You see, so it's this and proposition. And then I'm not going to go into it, but the Chinese concept of whole process people's democracy is an and proposition as well. So here we can see some very unique this and that constructions. And these are the major defining policies of the rise of China and how China continues to see itself rising and playing a constructive position in a new world order. Not where China says it aims to be the new hegemon or the new superpower, but leading from the middle and leading through a coalition of differences, right? Okay. So thanks for reminding me that I needed to do that to get out of today's talk. I don't know if I've sufficiently answered your question. I think I have, but if you want to redirect me, feel free to do so. Any other question?
Thank you. Arnab?
Hello, Professor. It was a brilliant lecture and a presentation. I really enjoyed it, but there was one question that I was thinking about. It's about the like you mentioned that that Chinese philosophy and society has a collective being in the world, as in a communitarian way. Now, this kind of communitarian way also has to deal with the problem of the many, the one and the many. So I was thinking that where does individual choice, like this is a problem in like presently in my country, also in India, as some reactionary forces think that it's best to here can act to a nostalgic like golden age kind of thing, but China in many ways is obviously way different, but historically and in the present. But what I was thinking, the problem of the many and the one is that like considering the hyper individualism of Western societies, and also the communitarian society of China. How do you see free will and free will not in the in the sense of being determined by desires of the market or by algorithms in algorithmic society, but free will that in the general in the sense of the Enlightenment. How do you see that as a sort of like category existing in China, or in a future that that includes the many and the one in a harmonious whole?
Well, thank you for the question. I was initially concerned that you were going to criticize me, as a lot of Indians do when I give the lecture, because they take offense that I accuse Siddhartha of having something like a Western type of ego subjectivity. And they say, it's wrong to say that Indian thought was dominated by the law of non-contradiction, that it was far more nuanced. And my point would be, Western thought itself is far more nuanced than the formal modes of expression. But those formal modes of expression are the ones that rule. They're the ones that are hegemonic. So it's not to say that you don't see that sort of diversity. And certainly in a civilization as old and as rich as Indians, you're going to see a lot of nuance that could be powerfully deployed in an argument against the point that I was making, even though the point that I was making was not precisely that. So, but that wasn't your point. I thought you were going to go in that direction. So, and I have to say honestly, it was a little difficult for me to follow you, because your connection, it was inconsistent, and so your voice was breaking up for me. I don't know if other people experienced the same thing, but it was difficult. But to try to pull something out of it, I wrote a paper several years ago after Sandel, the Harvard philosopher who came to China to promote his communitarian philosophy. And I was part of the mini conference that welcomed him and discussed his thought. And unlike my Chinese colleagues, who have a tendency of being very, very polite to distinguished foreign visitors, I completely showed my ass and attacked him, and said that the communitarian philosophies, at least as we would understand it from the Western, from Etzioni to Sandel and others, is really something fundamentally different from the Chinese understanding of being in the world. What's interesting is Heidegger steals being in the world from Okakura, doesn't cite him, plagiarizes him, and makes it the central concept in being and time as a critique of Western cogito subjectivity, which he says has created this crisis in the West and then exported that crisis to the East in the form of Marxism and the Soviet Union, but also a radical modern transformation of Japan, in which these societies have completely abandoned their traditions and embraced a radical version of this, dark technological form of enlightenment or cogito being, which will now be a direct threat to us. And so in other words, if you want to know why Heidegger is evil, it's not just because he says the Jews get what they deserve. They're the ones who unleashed industrialism on us, and so therefore it's justified that they would be killed by industrial methods. That's evil, sure. But it's also evil because Heidegger says that, based on his observation of Japan and the Soviet Union, that these societies have become the worst versions of ourself. And in order to save ourself from them, we have to become the worst version of ourselves, even though that self was always wrong, right? Even though that self was, so he has to support Hitler and Fortress Europe against these Eastern societies, because they are becoming more Western than the West in a way, whereas the West had developed these thoughts over time and in resistance through an evolutionary resistance, a cultural evolutionary resistance of tradition versus the modern. That Japan had changed its speed, so it just completely destroyed its traditions, and the same thing largely in the Soviet Union, and that's what terrifies him and why he supports Hitler. But he steals this concept being in the world from Okakura, and we know this because Heidegger's supervisor was Husserl, and Okakura sent his student to study with Husserl the same time Heidegger was studying with Husserl, and we know that they were often studying, that these two men, Heidegger and the Japanese student, were studying together at Husserl's house. And so this is where he encounters this concept. And interestingly, the critique that Husserl writes of being in time, he knows where Heidegger gets this concept being in the world, and he accuses Heidegger of backsliding in betraying Western rationalism and backsliding into Asian mysticism. So in any event, I don't know how to answer your question because it was a little fuzzy. So I'm really talking around it and probably missing your point. But if you want to write your point in your reflection for next week, that way I can look at it and see it and treat it with more rigor.
Sure, Professor. Actually, my connection is a bit fuzzy, so I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. We're all over the world right now, so that's the way it is. The fact that we can do what we're doing is marvelous.
Okay,
Any other-
Professor. Thank you.
Great. And we can take Kadu's question as the last one.
Hello. Thanks for the lecture. A lot of new knowledge to process for me, at least. My question, and I may be getting a bit ahead of ourselves, is about Sino-Soviet splits. At least when I learned about it, I learned that it was about geopolitical skirmishes, especially in the Ussuri River and the Xinjiang region, and also about mutual suspicion under nuclearization processes in both China and USSR. But I've also learned that it was about de-Stalinization under Khrushchev, and Mao reading it as a revisionist and compromise with imperialism. But today you showed that Mao thinking it's incongruent with Stalin's thinking. So how does that play out?
Well, it plays out in a weird way because China needed the Soviet Union, and Mao was willing to work with the Soviets because it was politically useful to do so, even though he didn't like Stalin. But where you really see the start of the Sino-Soviet break is in 1956. And this is generally attributed to the secret speech of Khrushchev, which initiates de-Stalinization, which is problematic for the Chinese, not because they like Stalin, but for other reasons. Okay, and I'll maybe return to that in another class. But there was a more fundamental reason, which is by 1956, the Chinese were suspicious that the Soviet advisors had misled them on the first five-year plan. And that the way the Soviets had advised their economic construction was going to make China dependent on the Soviet Union for technology and capital. And this is you have to understand that the whole Chinese Revolution is about returning sovereignty to China, right? So this is what will trigger actually the Great Leap. The Great Leap will be a tactical reaction to the compromised perception they perceive from what they believe were the mistakes encouraged by the Soviet Union. So they're going to have to continue to do some of the things from the first 5-year plan because those projects are underway and they've already invested a lot of money and political legitimacy into them. But they're also going to have to do something else. They're going to have to radically transform their agricultural economy, which is what they do, right? And I'm gonna give you a teaser just to show you how crazy things are going to get in this class. The Great Leap, we can never describe the Great Leap in China as a success because we can never say that the ends justify the means. We can never say that. But as a Marxist, you need to understand that the ends always justify the means. And the Great Leap was monumentally successful. It radically transformed 90% of the Chinese economy in 3 years. And with a few small little tweaks in 60 and 61, it not only produced food surpluses when China was previously having to import food, it also produced surpluses that were used for China to self-finance its development to the point where it could open up. And it only abandoned that system of collective agriculture in the mid-1980s when it was able to do something better. Okay. And you have to understand that collectivization, which was, expressed as a type of leftism, was really just the Marxist equivalent, the term for industrializing agriculture to realize economies of scale. And although there were tragedies associated with the Great Leap, and certainly some misguided policies, the majority of those tragedies happened in a single province. In other words, something went wrong in the leadership and the management of one province in particular. And that's why we have so many people from Anhui province living in Shanghai and in Beijing. Okay. But we can never say that the Great Leap was successful. We always have to describe it as a tragic failure. And the reason we have to do that is because it's insensitive. A lot of people were diminished by it, but it was and what's interesting about the Great Leap is that it was emulating what the Soviet Union did in the late 1920s because it didn't have a choice either. It found itself alone in the world. So, but the Sino-Soviet split, you're right to point out that there was a difference already in 37. Interestingly, when the Civil War restarted in 1945 after the defeat of the Japanese, the Americans pressed the Kuomintang to a two-state solution. And as Mao was winning, Stalin pressed him for a two-state solution. And Mao answers Stalin with "The Red Army enters Nanjing," a poem. Neither the Kuomintang nor the CPC wanted a two-state solution. But the other major powers did because it was a way of dividing China, and they hoped to manipulate her that way. The way that, we have manipulation on the Korean Peninsula today. So, and there are also other things that the Soviet Union did. That originally, Xinjiang, there was a warlord in Xinjiang who wanted to break out and join the Soviet Union, but the Soviets forced him to stay as part of China. China would have been willing to let Xinjiang go at that point if the Soviets had taken it. And we believe that maybe the Soviets did that as a poison pill strategy, that that it would end up creating problems down the road for China, which the Soviet Union would be called intermediate, which would give them leverage. But you know, if you look at why does China allow Mongolia to go? Might have allowed Xinjiang to go, but took it when the Soviet forced them, but will never let Tibet go. Tibet's non-negotiable. Can never let Tibet go. Why? It's where the major rivers in China start. Whoever controls Tibet controls agriculture in China. Period. Okay. I think that's enough for today.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Mahoney. And I think we can wrap it up. See you all next Sunday.
Someone wrote, Gabriel, is there a video or image? We can't see it.
It was like 2
Oh,
hours
it
ago,
was
though.
the very beginning, and
Yeah.
then we actually see it.
All right. That was date stamp or timestamp 22:15. But I don't know if that's my 22. I would assume it's my 22 because now it's 23:58 for me. So maybe the message took some time. Let's see. Someone has responded to JP already, so that's fine. Okay, and I'll try to post an updated version of the syllabus in the group folder, and you'll be able to access all that. Okay, but I'm not going to deal with that until tomorrow because I'm going to go to bed now.
All right.
Have a nice day.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Bye.